All right, welcome back to the Bees Like That podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chris. I thought today, first let me give you some context. So I went to a conference this year in Washington, D.C. This man on the screen, his name is John Hamel. Anyway, he is a decades plus domestic violence social worker, and advocate, researcher, etc. And he presented at this conference that I went to in a session on domestic violence. Now, typically when I go to sessions on domestic violence, I disconnect. I'm compelled to disconnect entirely within usually the first 15 minutes, as what I typically encounter is more of what I heard in other sessions, meaning I'm not learning anything new or hearing anything that I haven't heard before. Not that explicitly and exclusively and completely that everything is false. It's just some of it is, and most, if not all, of the sessions that and trainings that I've been a part of fail to paint a complete picture of the issue. And they do one thing universally, and that is to gender the issue, which I think is a mistake. Now, by no means do I consider myself to be an expert on domestic violence, but what I am is a person with a mind for reason, a basic ability to use some deductive logic, and a nature to ask some questions when and if I feel they're appropriate. Some of the things that you hear regarding domestic violence, or at least that I hear, just don't seem internally to check out or to connect. Like when we're dealing with people, human beings, it's I can't think of a single situation. Well, I can, and even that's not true. I was going to say that women have 100% of the time women have babies, but sometimes they don't. Some women don't have the ability to reproduce. But anyway, point is, any issue or topic, when someone says 100% of the time this is true about this gender and 100% of the time this is true about this gender, anyone, I would hope or expect, would ask at least one or two questions, be inquisitive in some form or shape or fashion. But what you see is like people are generally incurious, and they just fall in line and step with what seems to be like an ideological, I don't want to say cult, but there's definitely an ideology here that's pervasive. And anyway, this presentation that I went to was very refreshing. It included a lot of the things that you hear typically in domestic violence presentations and trainings. However, it included a lot of other things. Like, it painted the entire picture, which I think is imperative, especially with something as polarizing as domestic violence. Anyway, I'm going to react to this video, but John's going to be doing most of the talking because he's the expert here. I'm just someone who is still on a journey learning, but I ask a lot of questions and I want to know the more accurate version of things and what the current data and research suggest, point to, and even prove. John talks about in this basic video some of the more common myths about domestic violence. Let's get right into it.
I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area, California, with an expertise in the field of domestic violence, also known as intimate partner abuse. For the past 25 years, I've provided treatment services to perpetrators, victims, and their families. I am also the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed scholarly journal Partner Abuse, published quarterly by Springer Publishing, and I'm currently a visiting fellow at the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. The purpose of this short video is to provide you with a brief overview of the research upon which my online courses are based.
So let me just briefly pause here. I just want to acknowledge that in a world and culture of credentialing, I think that we check a lot of the boxes here with John. This video is an older video. I think it might be 8 years old. However, I spoke to this man on the phone this morning for about 30 minutes. He's still active in the work and in the research, and it also informs me that they're updating at least the last decade of current research soon on the website that he's going to detail for y'all here in a minute. But for those of you out there who it's important to that their experts are credentialed, here we go.
Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse among married, cohabitating, and dating partners is a universal problem and occurs in same-sex as well as opposite-sex relationships. However, it was not until the 1980s that domestic violence began to be taken seriously in the United States. Due to the diligent efforts of victim advocates, laws were enacted that help keep victims safe and hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes. Additionally, a large network of shelters and other services has become available to victims and their families. No longer is domestic violence regarded simply as a family problem, something that happens behind closed doors. Note the preponderance of news stories, for example, about celebrities who've abused their partners, incidents that would have gotten little notice in the past. There is no question that things are much better today. However, while much progress has been made, the current system is not without its limitations. First, there are inherent flaws in the judicial system response to domestic violence. Vigorous arrest and prosecution policies have led to an increase in arrests. But as the number of arrests have increased, the percentage of successfully prosecuted cases has decreased. This is because so many cases involve lower-level types of violence, or there's been mutual abuse and a clear perpetrator cannot easily be identified. These cases usually have to be dropped. In a number of states like California, alternatives that would include deferred prosecution, which would otherwise mandate some form of treatment, are expressly prohibited. There's also evidence that when victims are denied a voice in the decision to prosecute, as they are in so-called mandatory arrest states, they're less likely to call the police in the future, putting them at risk for further victimization. And finally, men account for the vast majority of domestic violence arrests and prosecutions, even for misdemeanor crimes that do not involve serious injury to the victim. The percentage of female domestic violence perpetrators in the general population is actually very comparable to the percentage of male perpetrators. Arresting.
I just want you to pay attention to some of the language and things that he's saying right here. This is important to note. There's a difference, and he'll cover this, but there's a difference between saying that the percentages of female to male domestic violence perpetrators and male to female domestic violence perpetrators are comparable. There's a difference between saying that and saying that it is equally dangerous for men as it is for women, meaning it's physically equally dangerous for men as it is for women. We all know that that's an untruth. Women are at substantially more risk for physical harm than men are when these things turn into battery situations or violent assault situations. So just let that be clear and maintain that. Keep that in the forefront of your mind. If at all some of this stuff you begin to resist some of the things that he says here, just maintain that.
Men, therefore, only addresses part of the problem. Additionally, there are flaws inherent in our current intervention efforts. Well-designed, sound outcome studies have found that the prevailing treatment model mandatory in most states, the same-sex psychoeducational group for perpetrators, typically based on sociological analyses of gender and patriarchy, has proven to be only minimally effective in reducing rates of recidivism. Recent social science research provides some important clues on how mental health professionals and other intervention providers might improve treatment efficacy. A growing body of empirical data indicates that the current intervention paradigm is based on a number of erroneous assumptions which need to be challenged as alternative interventions are proposed and put into place. Let's take a look at 4 of these assumptions. Assumption number 1, domestic violence is the same as battering, a pattern of physical and emotional abuse that only gets worse over time. Assumption number 2. While women sometimes abuse men, they typically do so in self-defense or as a means of expressing anger.
This assumption number 2 is one, I mean, I've heard them all, but this assumption number 2 is one that I hear predominantly espoused in almost 100% of the domestic violence trainings that I've participated in.
Assumption number 3. The primary cause of domestic violence is patriarchy, social structures and prevailing norms that allow and encourage men to dominate women and to use domestic violence as a means of maintaining male privilege. Assumption number 4. Mutual abuse is rare between intimate partners, and treatment approaches that use the couples or family format are inherently unsafe for victims.
Now, this next statement that I make is tied to this, it's adjacent to this, but it's the same for domestic violence victims services, at least what I've been able to observe in the cities that I've lived in, and I've lived in a few. I've not lived in them all, so I can't speak for all of the places that I've not lived, but from what I've observed when paying attention is that while domestic violence victims services do say that they're a gender neutral and not a gender specific victim service, what you will see most of the time is at least nearly 100% or 100% of the people who access services at these victims resources agencies, etc., are women and children.
What is troubling about these assumptions is not simply that they're incorrect and that they drive treatment policies, but that they're rarely challenged, even by therapists who are trained in research methodology and are required by their respective professional organizations to provide appropriate treatment based on best practices. There are many reasons for this state of affairs, but a lack of reliable, accurate information is certainly an important one. Recognizing that most individuals working in the field of domestic violence, including most clinicians, do not have access to the most relevant peer-reviewed social science journals, and recognizing that more accessible information cannot always be trusted, I sought, in my capacity as editor-in-chief of the journal Partner Abuse, to make domestic violence research available in one easily accessible place. The resulting Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Project, or PASC, is a reliable research database on topics of most interest and relevance to scholars, clinicians, and policymakers, and provides a complete picture of domestic violence prevalence, risk factors, consequences, intervention, and policy. It is the most comprehensive domestic violence research project ever undertaken, involving 3 years of research and writing by more than 100 scholars from 20 universities and research centers. The PASC manuscripts collectively run a total of 2,657 pages. The manuscripts appeared in 5 special issues of the peer-reviewed journal Partner Abuse between 2012 and 2013. They are now free to the public, available online at www.domesticviolenceresearch.org.
I'm going to point to something else important here. Again, about credentialing and credibility. So most of you, well, a lot of you who are watching this likely have had experience writing papers of some form, and you've had to have at least 5 to 10 sources for these papers, and they've all had to be peer-reviewed or scientific journals. Otherwise, things they're not just conjecture, but they're based on data, science, research, and study. That's what this is. And the address here that's listed on this screen is domesticviolenceresearch.org, all one word. This is where all of this culmination of research can be found.
www.domesticviolenceresearch.org. The website contains all 17 complete manuscripts, including 1,700 summarized studies, organized in tables according to topic and subtopic in chronological order, as well as a 61-page summary of findings providing an overview of all 17 manuscripts and tables, as well as a shorter 12-page findings at a glance. So what do the past findings have to say about those 4 assumptions I mentioned earlier?
Pay attention.
Assumption number 1 is that domestic violence is the same as battering, a pattern of physical and emotional abuse that only gets worse over time. In fact, the two terms are completely distinct. The term domestic violence refers to any form of physical aggression, including single acts of pushing or grabbing that do not result in injuries. This type of domestic violence is by far the most prevalent. Battering, on the other hand, refers to a pattern of more serious physical assaults that typically, but not always, leads to injury, coupled with a pattern of emotional abuse and controlling and domineering behaviors, such as limiting the partner's access to family and friends, economic abuse, threatening the partner, and so forth. Individuals who are court-ordered to so-called batterer intervention programs do not...
Briefly, these differences are also likely to be different than the legal definition in your state of domestic violence. I've pointed to that in an earlier video, but certainly the more common definition of domestic violence or battery is different than the legal definition of domestic violence, at least in Washington.
Not always fit the profile of a true batterer, and yet they are typically exposed to the same curriculum and the same one-size-fits-all treatment approach. Assumption number 2, while women sometimes abuse men, they typically do so in self-defense or as a means of expressing anger. Research indicates that women assault their intimate partners as frequently as do men, and they do so for essentially the same reasons: in retaliation, to control or punish, to express feelings such as anger, or out of jealousy.
Listen to that. Pay attention to the language here. This is so important, because the common narrative is that this is a gendered issue and it's one way, that it's a unilateral occurrence, and that for all of the reasons just detailed, this unilateral abuse occurs to women. When he says the data and science and research suggests that this is not the case, pay more attention. Question the things that you've learned so far about domestic violence. Now, I want you to also understand that this isn't me taking a side. Not at all. This is me advocating for the entire picture about this very polarizing and important issue to be painted and framed accurately and completely.
The majority of women, and men for that matter, do not assault their partners for purposes of self-defense. Women also perpetrate emotional abuse and controlling behaviors as frequently as men. Men, however, more often engage in physical types of stalking and are far more likely to engage in sexual coercion, including rape. It should also be made clear that female victims are much more at risk than male victims of experiencing serious, life-threatening injuries.
And this is the part where in most of the conversations that I have, the things that I've said in response to this video, and the things that I've said in other videos, and in conversation and meetings with colleagues and peers, those things definitely get resistance, right? But not as much as when I say that this part about where most people get hung up and they don't want to talk anymore, and this is all that they need, where we know that women are at substantially more risk for serious physical harm than men are, and that it is more often men that inflict the more serious physical harm on women than it is women to men. This isn't where it gets complicated. That's not complicated. That's easy for anyone to take in, digest, and process. What happens is people become cognitively lazy. They don't want to take it any further. They've connected to something that feels morally right, and now you're connected to an ideology that you have to protect people from men, women from men. Generally, that's the feeling and sense that I get. But we cannot stop the conversation there.
Female victims are less able to defend themselves and have very good reason to express higher levels of fear. Still, there is much more symmetry than asymmetry across gender. Abuse is abuse, no matter who is the perpetrator. When female perpetrators are not held accountable for their behavior, they put their victims in danger, become themselves potential targets for retaliation, and because children are at risk of repeating what they observe, there's an increase in the likelihood that their violence will be carried on into the next generation. According to assumption number 3, the primary cause of domestic violence is patriarchy. That is, social structures and prevailing norms that allow and encourage men to dominate women and to use domestic violence as a means of maintaining male privilege. Attitudes supportive of violence are a risk factor for domestic violence perpetration, but these attitudes are best understood as personality characteristics of particular individuals, rather than social norms per se, as large representative sample surveys find little support for domestic violence perpetration in the general population, and less so for assaults against women compared to men. Some studies have found correlations between the status of women and rates of female domestic violence victimization, especially in underdeveloped countries. But other countries have not found such correlations. And in the United States, studies find that men who believe in strict gender roles are not any more violent than men with egalitarian views. While social factors are more important in some countries than others, research from around the world indicates that domestic violence perpetration is also correlated with other factors, such as having been exposed to abuse or dysfunction in one's family of origin, having an aggressive personality, poor impulse control, being in a high conflict relationship, and the stress of low income and unemployment. With few exceptions, these factors are the same across gender. These findings suggest that improving economic, social, and political opportunities for women will not be sufficient in stopping domestic violence, because domestic violence is essentially a human problem and not strictly one of gender. The overemphasis on patriarchy as a cause of domestic violence has important clinical implications. Emerging research has determined conclusively that perpetrators are significantly less likely to continue their violence when they're able to have a trusting, respectful relationship with their treatment provider, and when they are afforded the kinds of interventions that suit their particular needs. Advising a man who has progressive views on gender relations, but who has poor impulse control and lacks interpersonal communication skills, telling that man that he needs to stop exercising his male privilege, only demonstrates incompetence and risks undermining the relationship. Furthermore, such advice...
What is he saying here? You probably understand, but I'm going to simplify it even more. I've said this before in other episodes, but you cannot misdiagnose or misidentify a problem and then come up with treatments and solutions to treat the root cause of the real problem, the real issue, right? There's no application there, and it may actually not even apply to the manufactured or misidentified or misdiagnosed problem. Why? Because it's not actual, it's not real, it's not based in reality. So we have to, again, paint the complete picture, accurately identify an issue, then that's like with anything else in life. personally, romantically, professionally, you have to assess as best as possible and accurately identify an issue. If you have an oil pump problem in your car and you change the water pump, you don't have a water pump issue, but you still have an oil pump issue. You can't change the water pump to fix an oil pump issue. It's the same principle. I know that's an oversimplification, but I wanted to make it as simple as possible so people get it.
This is obviously less than helpful when working with female perpetrators or members of the LGBTQ community. According to assumption number 4, mutual abuse is rare between intimate partners, and treatment approaches that use the couples or family format are inherently unsafe. In fact, the majority of domestic violence is bidirectional or mutual, and women are as likely as men to initiate the violence. Furthermore, there is a high correlation between child abuse and intimate partner abuse. Well-designed outcome studies find couples therapy to be as effective or more so than a traditional group format in cases involving lower levels of abuse, and just as safe. Outcome studies have not yet been conducted on the efficacy of family therapy for domestic violence, but this format has been found to be effective for substance abusers, a population that shares many characteristics with domestic violence perpetrators. And yet, couples and family counseling are forbidden in most states for court-mandated offenders. They are forbidden even though many abusive couples want this type of help and believe that it can help them. The good news is that there is now a growing movement in the United States towards evidence-based intervention. Inspired by the failure of traditional models, as well as the promise of new findings from domestic violence research scholars, an increasing number of policymakers, law enforcement, victim advocates, and treatment providers are looking for ways to more effectively reduce domestic violence in our communities. I offer my online courses as one contribution to this effort. Thank you for listening.
So again, I want to be 100% clear. This isn't me picking a side. This is me, again, advocating that the entire picture be painted accurately and correctly, and that this topic and issue is handled appropriately. This is a huge responsibility. If you're a professional and you work within services, and especially if your scope of focus is primarily domestic violence, you have a responsibility to be as abreast on the most current research and modalities and anything related to the topic as humanly possible. This is your responsibility, not just to yourself, but your community and to humanity, period. Because this is not just this cannot just be a job. This cannot just be something that you check into mindlessly, day to day, 9 to 5, get your hours, get your paycheck, and then cut out. That's completely unfair, but you have to consider the people who are impacted by this. And it's not just men, it's not just women, it's not just victims, it's not just perpetrators. There are children and families involved in this mess. And we often will use women and children as pawns, as emotional pawns and leverage in this whole scenario of nobility, romance, and poetry, and neglect to understand or generalize the far-reaching implications for after this is done. Once you're done with that, once you're done with your grandstanding and all of the above and anything associated with your ego in this topic, once that's over, the people who are impacted by this and all of that are still then left to maintain and pick up the pieces, to wade through that wreckage. And for a lot of them, they don't know how to access the resources once they're not connected to a system, male or female. And if you're a male victim of domestic violence, one, it's socially unacceptable to seek assistance as a victim. Socially unacceptable to call law enforcement. It's socially unacceptable to not place yourself in the driver's seat, so to speak, to protect the interests of your partner and your children, because you don't want to further expose them to any of the ugliness that's already taking place, and that maybe and certainly most often is contained in the legal system while these things are mitigated or litigated rather, or whatever. So just to highlight some of those things and draw some clearer lines, brighter lines around an issue that, again, so much of the time I see people who are credentialed and considered professionals in a field are just out and out lazy. They're not doing it right, they're not doing it justice, and they're not doing the right thing. I have, and I've been sitting on a video that I made about my experience in childhood and in adulthood with domestic violence. And I haven't put it out yet. And one of the reasons why I haven't put it out yet is there's stuff in there that is really difficult for me to be open and really difficult for me to openly share about and be transparent about. And it's considering the way that I framed it, like it's not just attached to another issue. I don't just kind of gloss over it and say, hey, yeah, this happened to me and this happened to me and this happened to me. No, I go into great detail about my experience in childhood and in life and my relationships. And it's been really difficult for me. So it might seem to some who don't or are not privy to that information or history about my life that I'm on some form of a crusade, which is inaccurate. It can be any further from the truth. I just have a unique relationship with this topic and understand what an impact it can have on an individual, especially on a man. So that's one of the reasons why it means so much to me that this topic, among others, but this one especially, is framed in the right way. The proper context is used. It's not leveraged for, bureaucratic pole vaulting purposes or to, for optics and other political maneuverings and stuff like that, that it's actually taken on an objective, honest, and complete road and trajectory and maintained, meaning that we're using current, evolving best practices and data with regard to the research, what's disseminated, what's discussed, treatment modalities, methodologies, whether or not they work, etc. We don't just present one, and since it's the one we got, take it for the one that we'll always have and use. You don't understand how dangerous that can be? Oh. Anyway, I appreciate y'all listening, and tap in with John Hamel on his YouTube channel. But if you haven't you didn't do it on the way in, do it on the way out. Hit that like, subscribe, and post notification bell so you can stay up to date on all the cool, informative, because this isn't fun, this topic, things we talk about here on the Bees Like That podcast. Peace, y'all.